This little boy was so amazing that he was about to be hit by the lorry on the other side of the road. His body began to fade away. 2 weeks earlier, the boy had been transported back in time. Before the boy had recovered, he traveled back to the crash site. He watched as the lorry crashed into his mother, but there was nothing he could do. Then a grown man stops him.
Time travel. Okay, just like I did to come to see you. I'm you, Henry. Understand? When you're grown up, we're the same person.
With that, the man suddenly disappeared and, leaving behind only a pile of clothes, the grown-up Henry returns to the library where he works just in time. He is 28 years old at this point. He puts on the clothes that have been scattered aside. He returns to work as if nothing had happened. He tries to live a normal life. Until that day, he meets a beautiful girl called Claire. The girl, who is only 20 years old, recognizes Henry immediately. She seems to know him very well and invites him warmly to dinner. But as Henry is finishing up, he suddenly crosses into an alley. He doesn't seem to be able to control his powers. Henry has to break in and steal a suit. He is caught by a policeman on patrol just as he leaves the house. Luckily, Henry crosses over again. He escapes the police and is caught in the act, and just in time for a date with Claire.
When you're older, you'll travel back to when you were a little girl. I mean, I've known you since I was 6 years old. I wrote down every time that you came to visit me.
Yeah, it's like gravity. Big events pull you in.
I was a big fan.
So was he.
So Claire had met the 36-year-old Henry when she was 6 years old. She didn't believe at the time that Henry could travel through time and space, until she saw him disappear before her eyes. It was here that she began to feel an inexplicable affection for the man. Every once in a while after that, she saw Henry, who had traveled back in time. The last time she saw him was when Claire was 18. Now she was finally seeing Henry again. Henry takes a liking to this strange and familiar girl. They talk to each other on a park bench, and so they fall in love. Later, Henry is caught reading Claire's diary.
Are you reading my diary?
I was trying to find dates. Dates that I go to see you. So I can tell the little girl we met. I'm not important to her. I need to be able to tell her I was coming to see her so she moved away.
On this day, Henry traveled back in time to the day when his mother had not yet died. He told his mother of his feelings for Claire, although the mother did not know that Henry was her future son, but she gave her blessing to the man who looked so dear to her.
Make sure that girl knows how you feel about her.
Your son loves you very much.
I know.
After crossing back in time, he told his father that he was getting married. The father had been depressed since the death of his mother. He blamed his son for having the power to transcend time and space, but not to save his wife. But even so, he took out his wife's diamond ring and gave it to his son. Henry then places the ring on the hand of the love of his life. Wandering through time, he finally meets the love of his life. And with Claire's love, Henry found a place in his heart. But on the very day of his wedding, Henry travels uncontrollably again. You wouldn't believe it, the man who just had a full head of black hair, but at the wedding, he's gray at the temples.
He's got gray hair.
The wife soon realizes that this is Henry from the future. She accepted the change with equanimity. The wedding went off without a hitch. Evening, young Henry finally returns to the dinner party. He then invited Claire to dance with him, but just as the two return to the wedding room to mingle, Henry has crossed over again, this time in the same grove. The clothes were laid out neatly on them. On the grass, young Claire had been waiting for a long time, but when she learned that Henry was getting married today, she suddenly became sad and she was jealous of herself.
What's wrong?
Nothing, I'm just hoping you're married to me.
Henry, on the other hand, returned, shared this anecdote with his wife. The two laughed at each other. They then fell asleep in each other's arms. After their wedding, they moved to their new home. Although Henry's sudden disappearances from time to time, Claire was troubled by his sudden disappearances. But through her love for Henry, Claire persevered in silence, until one time, when Henry disappeared for a fortnight and missed Christmas and New Year. Claire's long-suppressed emotions finally exploded. Without waiting for Henry to explain, she rushes off to work again. But when she left work late, she saw Henry waiting for her outside. The unpleasantness of the previous situation is instantly dispelled, and Henry, as a token of his apology, brought a lottery ticket from the past.
What did you do?
Our first winning 5 number is
17.
17.
Why you just won $5 million?
You can't do that. It's cheating.
Okay. Let's rip it out.
From then on they didn't have to run for their lives. The two exchanged their mansion for a mansion, and invited their friends to come and visit. Suddenly, the crowd heard a noise. When they went to check it out, they find Henry from the future lying on the ground, shot. Before they can ask, he has disappeared again. Before they could ask him, he had disappeared. It is at this point that Claire tells her husband that she is pregnant, but she soon miscarries. Henry believes that the loss was caused by the child's uncontrolled travel through time, so he goes to the famous Dr. Derek. He explains everything to him, but the doctor is clearly not convinced. Henry had to ask him to do a checkup on himself, but the doctor saw Henry disappear from the machine. That's when he believed him. After the examination, the doctor did not find out how to save the fetus. Soon, Tragedy struck again. The couple's second child left them. Henry was afraid that his wife's body would not be able to cope. He carried Claire on his back to have the ligation operation. After the operation, Henry crossed back into the familiar woods. There, Henry kissed 18-year-old Claire in an emotional moment. This shocked and shamed Claire, but she is still determined to marry him. On his return, Henry tells his wife about his tying the knot. She finally explodes after having endured it for so long.
You came to that meadow, and you forced yourself into the heart and the mind of a little girl. Wait, you think that I wanted this life? This husband that disappears without any kind of warning? Do you think anyone would want that? Who would want that?
I have a choice.
I never had a choice.
It was then that Henry realized that his crossing had taken away all of Claire's choices. The so-called love of his life was a nightmare from which he could never escape. And that very night, Claire meets the Henry of her youth. The irritation that she had felt quickly dissipated. The two of them kissed. Later, Claire becomes pregnant again. Knowing the truth, Henry has to do everything he can to help. Miraculously, the baby is growing. And one early morning, Henry travels to the future again. This man suddenly appears naked in a zoo hall. You think he's a pervert? No. He's just crossed over here. He rushes to get dressed and is ready to leave. Then a little girl called out to him. Daddy! This girl was his future daughter, Alba. Like Henry, she had the ability to travel through time and space, and she can sometimes control when and where she travels.
Yeah. It's so good to meet you, Alba.
Me too, Daddy. I've really missed you.
How long's it been? How old were you when I died? It's okay.
5.
Henry, who returned later, told his wife the good news and to put her mind at rest, but he doesn't say anything about his death. A daughter is born and the family lives happily ever after. The family lived happily ever after. Finally, the daughter turns 5. Henri looks a little panicked, and on that day, the future Alba travels back in time to the 5-year-old Alba. She tells her young self that her father will pass away on Christmas Day. Claire is left to grieve and comfort her husband. That day, Henry's screams come from inside the house. It turns out that he has accidentally traveled to the South Pole. One leg was badly frostbitten. He will be wheelchair-bound for months. If the crossing had taken place during this time, it would have been extremely dangerous. The daughter tries to teach her father how to control the crossing, but Henry fades away in front of her. And this time, he sees himself on his deathbed. The family is by his side. Henry is relieved to see this. He was able to take a more positive outlook on life. He taught his daughter how to cope with the unexpected events of the journey. He is now more in love with his wife. Finally, on Christmas Day, Henry called his family and his best buddies. He doesn't want to leave his wife to face it all alone. Under the stars, the two lovers embraced with tears in their eyes. But Henry crosses to that fateful grove with a wild deer by his side. Suddenly, the silence of the forest is shattered by the sound of a gunshot. When the dying Henry returned again, family and friends are gathered around him. Despite all the reluctance, Henry leaves this world, but his journey was far from over. It was when his daughter was 9 years old that, 39 years old, Henry returned to the familiar woods. When she heard the news, Claire rushed to the love of her life.
Why didn't you tell me you were coming? I would have been here waiting.
I don't want you to wait. I don't want you to spend your life waiting.
Though the encounter was so brief, Claire would still put down folded laundry in the woods and, waiting patiently for her husband's next return.